So good morning everyone. It's time now for our Sabbath meeting. This morning this is number 7 in our ministry series, and we begin our study in Matthew chapter 25 verse 31 and then onwards. This morning we're going to talk about why ministry is important, partly as a qualification to enter into Christ's kingdom. We must have the disposition, we must have the desire to minister to others and put that desire into action to enter into the kingdom, because to minister to others is a part of what the kingdom is about. Remember what the law says, to love God supremely and your neighbour as yourself. So we have to come out of ourselves and into God's ways and into the principles that govern God's kingdom in order to enter into that kingdom. And the training for this begins on this earth and it continues throughout eternity. But if we have no desire, if we want to be selfish and centre our whole lives about our own self, our own needs, me and my life, then we disqualify ourselves from entering into that kingdom. One of the most pointed places which it talks about this is in Matthew 25 verse 31 and then onwards. And so we're going to read from this to talk about this as a qualification to enter into that kingdom. Now, to minister to others, it has to come from the heart. We can do it just because it's an obligation, but that is not true ministry, because true ministry has to do with where the heart is. It should be something that is a part of our being, and this comes through the development from rebirth, through reformation or sanctification, and then into a more widespread ministry for others. It's a sequence of 3 phases that we have identified, and we see that this last one is essential as the others, especially for the 144,000 who will finish the work. And so we read here in Matthew 25 verse 31, "When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory. And before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats." So we want to think a little bit about what is the difference between sheep and goats. It's a distinction that has been given here because there are characteristics that sheep have and characteristics that goats have. But we don't want to put all the emphasis on these 2 animals. We want to talk about people. But 1 or 2 things are plain when you have some dealings with sheep and when you have some dealings with goats. And I would say one of the things that comes out with a goat is that it has a more independent mind than a sheep. A sheep has a very dependent mind, and if it's in a flock, it thinks very much to do with the flock. It also becomes very attached to the shepherd. I think a goat might be quite attached too, but a goat definitely has a more independent frame of mind and is able to act more independently. Now, in the real world, this can be good or bad in a person. To be able to act independently to follow God when the crowd is going the other way is a good thing. But in this context, I think we're talking about sheep are able to be gathered, are able to be herded more easily than goats. And the goat is normally able to stand up to wild animals better than sheep can. Wild dogs, wolves, and that type of thing. Okay. Verse 33, and he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come ye, blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Because the sheep have become dependent on the shepherd Jesus, but the goats have a more independent stance. I think this is the thought there. Verse 35. We see the characteristics of the sheep. When I was an hungered and you gave me, for I was an hungered and you gave me meat, I was thirsty and you gave me drink, I was a stranger and you took me in, naked and you clothed me, I was sick and you visited me, I was in prison and you came unto me. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered, and fed thee, or thirsty, and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger, and took thee in, or naked, and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick and in prison, and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of these, of the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. So Christ identifies himself with the sheep. The sheep hear his voice and obey him. So we have obedience in love for Jesus. Obedience in love for Jesus, a willingness to serve. And this is the principle that is there in the sheep, a willingness to serve. And this is what is commended by Jesus in the sheep. And when the sheep are ministering to other sheep, then they are fulfilling the law which says, love your neighbour as yourself. You're also fulfilling the commandment which says, love God supremely. The first 4 is love God supremely. The last 6 is love your neighbour. And then by contrast, we look at the second group, which is the group of the goats. Then shall he say also unto them on the left hand, Depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was a hungered, and you gave me no meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you took me not in, naked, and you clothed me not, sick and in prison, and you visited me not. Then shall they also answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered, or athirst, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister unto thee? Then shall he answer them, saying, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you did it not to one of the least of these, you did it not unto me. And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous unto life eternal. So here we have the goats on this side, who didn't respond. They didn't obey from the heart. They didn't respond to Jesus. They blocked him out. They may have given lip service. Lip service might have been there, but practical godliness was absent. Was missing. And practical godliness shows where the heart is. Practical godliness or lack of practical godliness shows where the heart is. They didn't love their neighbour. In fact, they persecuted their neighbour. In many cases, because the general wicked are here on this side too, the persecutors. And this scene is being enacted today in everyone's lives. We're all choosing whether we're going to obey Jesus, whether we're going to love as Jesus loved, whether we're willing to serve, whether we love our neighbour, or are we going to disobey? Is practical godliness missing? We didn't love, we persecuted our neighbour instead. And everyone on the earth is being judged right now, and this is very relevant with the idea of mandatory vaccinations, for instance. We have a situation where people are choosing whether they are going to be a persecuting person or they are going to be a freedom person and love their neighbour. Now I'd like to go to Psalm 41, verse 1 next. And we want to read a very good verse there, which brings out these principles again. Psalm 41, verse 1. Blessed is he that considereth the poor. The Lord will deliver him in trouble. So this is a very wonderful verse. Blessed is he that considereth the poor. The Lord will deliver him in trouble. So here is a greater incentive to follow the Lord, because the Lord will deliver. Will give deliverance to those who follow his ways. And we shall see this as time goes on. The tendency today, the strong push is to persecute those who refuse vaccination, and we will see that the Lord will deliver them, those who are persecuted at some stage or another. Certainly when Jesus comes, we will be delivered from all oppression. Verse 2 from the same chapter, the Lord will preserve him and keep him alive, and he shall be blessed upon the earth, and thou wilt not deliver him unto the will of his enemies. These are very precious promises for us today. The Lord will strengthen him upon the bed of languishing. Thou shalt make all his bed in his sickness. So what a wonderful promise that is, and we should be claiming these promises on a daily basis if we are fulfilling the conditions. We want to turn now to Psalm 82 and verses 3 to 4. Psalm 82 and verses 3 to 4. Defend the poor and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and needy. Deliver the poor and needy. Rid them out of the hand of the wicked. Here is a call in the Bible to God to defend the poor and the fatherless. And who inspired this call? The Lord himself inspired it. He's the one who inspires the biblical writers to claim the promises. And this call is a blessing to us today, that when we minister to others, that he will answer our prayers and deliver us. And finally, in these verses, we go to Proverbs 19 and verse 17. Proverbs 19 and verse 17. He that hath pity upon the poor lendeth unto the Lord. Now, would you like to lend money to God? Certainly, we should be wanting to do this. We should be wanting to work for God. Now, if we want to work directly for God, then we do God's will when we are a sheep, when we feed the hungry, when we clothe the naked, when we visit those in prison. We are working for the Lord, and he recognizes this as his work, as his calling. And we will receive a reward, perhaps not in this life, but in the life to come, but probably in this life too, because he understands that what he has told us to do personally, our personal calling, and he will work for those who work for him, who work for others. And when they work for others, they're working for him. And so we should, if we want to know what God's will for us is, his will is that we are born again. His will is that we become sanctified or made holy or made whole in mind and heart and in life, and that we work for others. 3 steps. These are 3 steps to getting ready for Christ's coming. And we'll just finish this verse. He that hath pity upon the poor lendeth unto the Lord. Now what will the Lord do? And that which he hath given will he pay him again. So God will pay us back in some way, may not be in money, maybe in some other blessing, when we lend to him. Now how do we lend by him? To him by considering the poor, by clothing the naked, by ministering to others, by healing the sick, by ministering to the sick. So this is the work that he has given us to do. And you can be sure that if you do this work in the right frame of mind, with the right heart motives, that a reward will come one day. And what a wonderful day that will be. We want now to go to the book of Luke, chapter 14. And we want to start in verse 12. And here once again we have the theme of ministry. And this theme of ministry is seen in who do we minister to? Do we minister to those who can give us back what we give to them? Or do we minister in the spirit of heaven, where we give something not knowing whether it shall return to us or not? And in that sense, we are dependent upon God to give to us again. And this ministry that is spoken about here is a different type of ministry to the one which Jesus rebuked. And let us read it now, the story now, in verse 12 to 14. Luke chapter 14, verse 12 to 14. Then said he also to him that bade him, When thou makest a dinner or a supper, call not thy friends, nor thy brethren, neither thy kinsmen, nor thy rich neighbours, lest they also bid thee again, and recompense be made thee. Jesus is talking about reaching out beyond your comfort zone, beyond where you feel safe and secure. And certainly this is needed today, because with the lockdowns that have been on, there's so much poverty. People who were just making it before are now not making it in regard to their livelihoods, in regard to feeding their families, in regard to living adequately to supply their own needs. And there's a huge, huge volume of people, hundreds of millions, I would say, who have become poverty-stricken during these lockdowns. And it's not the virus that is their main danger. It is poverty and a situation of not being able to buy adequate food, not being able to buy adequate clothing, not being able to live in a reasonable place of residence. And so, let's read on. But when thou makest a feast, call the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind. And thou shalt be blessed, for they cannot recompense thee, for thou shalt be recompensed at the resurrection of the just. If you want to be at the resurrection of the just, then put into practice from the heart what Jesus is saying here, and now is the time to do it. Now. Because of the situation in the world, now is the time to take action. For those who are less fortunate than yourself, because of what is happening. And these troubles in the world are not going to get easier, they're going to get tougher. And the most vulnerable people are the ones who are going to suffer the most. Now is the time to begin the actions of fulfilling the law of loving your neighbour as yourself. And this is what Jesus wants us to do. He wants us to get to work as sheep, as the definition of sheep in this study from Matthew chapter 25. He wants us to be true sheep and to do this work, because now is the time when it's most needed at the end of this earth's history. And our salvation does depend upon us getting behind the work of Jesus in the world to take the gospel to all corners of the earth. And one or two people can't do it. We have so many demands in our ministry upon our means from poor people and from needy people. We cannot meet them all, but we can teach a message which we hope will unlock the hard-heartedness of those who can get activated, those who can get into action, those who have the abilities and the resources to work for others. And this is the purpose that Jesus has for us now, and we will be judged on whether we've taken up the challenge or whether we haven't. And if we take up the challenge, we know that Jesus is with us, that Jesus is behind us, that we're working for Jesus. And of course, we should do this in an intelligent way, under the leading and guiding of the Holy Spirit and under the direction as given in the Word of God. So let's now go to the book Christ Object Lessons, page 220. And we have a commentary there on some of what we have read. Page 220. And we'll read from about the middle of the page. First of all, we'll read the quote again. But when thou makest a feast, call the poor, the maimed, the lame and the blind, and thou shalt be blessed, for they cannot recompense thee. For thou shalt be recompensed at the resurrection of the just. Christ was here repeating the instruction he had given to Israel through Moses. At their sacred feasts, the Lord had directed that the stranger and fatherless, the widow which are within thy gate, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied. This was the Old Testament teaching that they were to take care of the weak, the compromised, the vulnerable among their own people. These gatherings were to be object lessons to Israel, being thus taught the joy of true hospitality. The people were throughout the year to care for the bereaved and the poor. And these feasts had a wider lesson. Now, what is the wider lesson that these feasts had? We shall see in the moment that this wider lesson, it is time to put into practice on a much wider scale than what it has already. And we are living in the time when we are formulating characters to be sheep or to be goats. And how we act will determine which we shall be. The spiritual blessings given to Israel were not for themselves alone. God had given the bread of life to them that they might break it to the world. So now is the time, if you are a sheep, or if you want to be a sheep, anyone can become a sheep. If we're a goat now, we can become a sheep. We can choose to be a sheep, even though we may not specifically recognise ourselves as such, because we will always feel inferior when we match ourselves with Jesus. But by choosing Jesus, we are choosing to become a sheep when we want to follow on to know him and to carry out his work. Now, the sheep, it is time for the sheep, the true sheep, to do the work, do the finishing work. And that is to follow the Lamb wherever he goes. And that is in character, and that is in work. That is the finishing work, to follow the Lamb, his character, and to do his work. Let's now go to Luke chapter 14 and verse 16, and we see there the excuses that were given as to why the people would not do the work of God that Jesus gave. Then said he unto him, A certain man made a great supper, and bade many, and sent his servants at supper time to say them that were bidden, Come, for all things are now ready. And they all with one consent began to make excuse. The first said unto him, I have bought a piece of ground, and I must needs go and see it. I pray thee, have me excused. And another said, I bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to prove them. I pray thee, have me excused. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. So here are the excuses. that people give for not attending the Great Supper. And what are they? In brief, we'll put it here as excuses. And what's the first excuse? Bought land. And he wanted to see the land. He wanted that to be the focus of his attention. The second one, bought oxen. We could say bought a new car. He wanted to go for a drive in the country. He wanted to test the car. He wanted to wash the car. He wanted to clean it. He wanted to service it. The third one is married. Married a wife. Now, all these things became excuses to not go to the supper, the Great Supper. And what does the Great Supper symbolise? If we go to page 222 of Christ Object Lessons, we read in the second full paragraph, all the excuses betray a preoccupied mind. To these intended guests, other interests had become all-absorbing. The invitation they had pledged themselves to accept was put aside, and the generous friend was insulted by their indifference. By the Great Supper, Christ represents the blessing offered through the gospel. The provision is nothing less than Christ himself. So the invitation is to Christ. The invitation is to Jesus. It is to choose Jesus and to become a sheep. But the excuses are rejecting Jesus. They're actually rejecting the gospel and rejecting Christ. That is making a person a goat. So they are rejecting Jesus. They're rejecting the gospel of Jesus. So we can see that all these things are tied together. Let's go to page 223. But in order to accept the invitation to the gospel feast, they must make their worldly interests subordinate to the one purpose of receiving Christ and his righteousness. In other words, they must put God first. And that's what we have to do. Today we are facing tests. And in these tests we must learn to put God first, because that is the key to gaining victory in life. That's the key to becoming a true sheep. To put God first, not make excuses that will consume all our time and energy. Now, of course, we can buy land today. We can buy a car or oxen. We can marry a wife. The point is that the wife can come to the gospel feast as well. The point is that the car can be used for God's purposes. The point is that the land can be bought to further the gospel work, to feed the hungry and to clothe the naked. We can buy land, and in our ministry we do that quite often. In poorer countries we try and secure some land so that people can be fed in the long term, that they have work to do and not just living off us. So there's nothing wrong with these things in themselves, but when they become the main objective, when they become the main absorbing factors of our lives, that's when we become a goat. God gave all for man, and he asks him to place his service above every earthly and selfish consideration. He cannot accept a divided heart. The heart that is absorbed in earthly affections cannot be given up to God. The lesson is for all time. So it's for today. It's not just back then when Jesus spoke it. It's for all time. Because this applies to all. We just changed the oxen to a car, and it applies to today, or a house or something like that. Buying land was a big thing back then. It's a big thing today. Marrying is a big thing back then. It's a big thing today. So God gave all for man, and he asks him to place his service above every earthly and selfish consideration. He cannot accept a divided heart. The heart that is absorbed in earthly affections cannot be given up to God. The lesson is for all time. We are to follow the Lamb whithersoever he goes. This is the characteristics of the 144,000. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. That is their point, that is their focus, and that is what makes them the 144,000, and also what makes them sheep. My sheep hear my voice and they follow me. What about the 144,000? They hear the voice of Christ and they follow him in character and in work. And that is the key to the finishing of the work in these last days. Page 223, Christ Object Lessons. His guidance is to be chosen, his companionship valued above the companionship of earthly friends. So Christ becomes the main focus of those who will finish the work. And he's preparing people now to go forward in this plan. Christ says, "He that loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." That's something, isn't it? That's something. That is putting God first. Putting God first. And this has to even come into our family life too. We have to be prepared to give all for Christ in order to fulfill our personal mission. So we'll stop there. It's been an important study and one that we should be meditating upon. And if you watch this, I suggest you watch it more than once, because let the thoughts sink into your mind. Are you going to be a sheep when you come before Christ, as we all will? or are you going to be a goat? And we all have to ask that question. We may not know what we are going to be, but we should choose now to take the steps of becoming sheep and not goats, because we've made it plain what those steps are. You must be born again. You must be reformed or sanctified, and then finally you must learn to minister as Jesus did and to follow his voice in ministering to others, less fortunate than yourself. Don't just minister to those who will reward you. It's talking about ministering to those who need that ministry, really need it in one way or another. So with those thoughts we shall finish now, and we will talk more about the gospel going to the highways and hedges next Sabbath. Thank you very much. God bless.